Today's video is kind of an extra video on my channel in which I'm going to be ranking all 45 books that I read during 2023. And I'm going to go from worst to best. And I have already compiled this list. Yes, I'm a nerd who uses Excel sheets a lot. So I will simply go from the lowest rated book on my list to the highest rated book. So if you're curious about the books that I read during the entire year of 2023 and how I liked them, then stick around. On the total bottom on my list is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a book that I DNF'd at 10%, and that's the reason why it is the lowest on my list. And if you want to know more about these 7 books that are the worst books in my opinion that I read in 2023, I made a totally separate video about that you can find here. And of course, there's also a video with my favorite books of 2023 that I will also be linking up here. On spot number 44 is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. If you like women to be represented in a way that is totally typical for the 50s and 60s without anything to say, any power in them. And this was more a horror book than a fantasy book. It was completely mismarketed to me, hence why it is so low. Then on spots 42 and 43 are Haunting Adeline and Hunting Adeline. These books again were hyped so much on TikTok and then didn't meet my expectations for them. They're also not fantasy, they're stalker romances, and there's a lot of trigger warnings. So if you want to read these books, first have a look at the trigger warnings before you actually invest your time in them. It was not worth mine. After that, on spot 41, we have Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. The reason I DNF'd this book and that it rates so low on this list is the narrator style that it's written in, with the narrator being a completely entitled ass, in my opinion, being very, condescending towards the reader, like, you wouldn't understand, I won't explain it to you. And other things also like, I own this shop, blah, blah, blah. I really loved the story of Yumi and the story of the Nightmare Painter, and I was looking forward to reading this book. However, the narrator style killed this book for me, so at chapter 9, I just decided to quit it because it wasn't worth it to me anymore. And then on spot 40, we have The Book Eaters by Sunyi Dean. I wanted to read this book. It was recommended to me a bunch of times. I bought the special Illumicrate edition, if I'm not mistaken, and I ended up really not liking it. I read about 20% of the book. It was too horror, doom and gloom, and not enough fantasy for me. On to the only book that I gave 2 stars on all of the books I rated in 2023 is Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I find the main character so whiny, so ridiculously annoying that I had a hard time connecting to this book. And I did quite enjoy Throne of Glass, but the Akotar series for me just didn't work. And the reason that I gave Akotar a 2 stars and that you will find the other book, the second book in the series, a little bit higher is because Temlin was really bad in the first book, and that girl should have run away way sooner. On to spot 38 was The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. I read this book on holiday, and the setting of the book was really interesting. You have these characters who kind of have to survive/compete to be admitted to a kind of secret society of, we're going to call them magicians for the sake of this video. So you have different people, different talents, and every chapter jumps from one character to the other, and weird things happen. But I felt so disconnected from every single one of these characters. I felt utterly annoyed by some of them. I liked where it was going, but then the plot lacked for me. I know there's a second and a third book, but I simply will not be picking those up, I think. It was a meh for me, and that's all of the 3-star books aren't specifically bad, but they were simply meh. Up next, we have my 3-star ratings for all of the Sarah J. Maas books. So we have from spot 37 to 34, we have A Court of Mist and Fury, Queen of Shadows, Hair of Fire, and Crown of Midnight. It's not that I don't like Sarah J. Maas's books, it's just that they're very predictable to me. They are enjoyable, but they're not the best books I've ever read. That's why they're so low on this list. Up next on spot number 33 is My Roommate is a Vampire by Jenna Levine. This is a fantasy romance. It was cute, but it wasn't the best read of my year. It had a little bit of spice at the end, which was nice, but other than that, it's an enjoyable book, but it's not like the highest hitting book out there. If you're into fantasy romance, I would highly recommend reading this. If you like a more chill setting, yeah, I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. Up next, we have Scarlett St. Clair's Queen of Myth and Monster. This is the second book in the Adrian X Isolde trilogy. In this book, we continue onto the story. I personally didn't like the turn that the story took in book 2. Yeah, that's why it has a 3 stars and it is on spot 32 on my list. Above that, we have spot number 31, The Witch and the Vampire by Francesca Flores. This is, I believe, a YA book in which we follow a witch and a vampire, 2 girls who already know each other. One of them is locked up in a tower, manages to escape, a whole plot line happens. I really enjoyed this book, but I kind of forget about it. And it's also just a standalone novel, so it doesn't end on a cliffhanger. There's nothing spectacular happening at the end. Well, yeah, it kind of does. So I really enjoyed this book, but it just wasn't, for me, it wasn't one of the best books that I've read this year, although it was very enjoyable. Then on spot number 30, we have Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher. I really enjoyed Thornhedge. The only reason that it's here is because it was a very short novel. I think this was the shortest book that I've read this year. And for me, I felt there could have been more going on. It could have been fleshed out a little bit more, but I did really like the setting of it. Again, there is someone locked up in a tower and someone protecting the tower, and we actually follow the storyline of the person protecting the tower and the reason why that other person is locked up and asleep in the tower. So it's like a different take on Sleeping Beauty, and I did really enjoy it. I just felt like it was very short and yeah, not super fleshed out. It was enjoyable, and I do really like the style of the book. And if you are looking for a very short book to read which tells a complete story, then I would highly recommend it. But for me, it was just a little bit kind of lacking. Above that, on spot 29 is The Stars Are Dying by Chloe C. Penaranda. I thought this book was such a slow-paced book that's why I gave it a 3 stars. I know that there will be more books in this series, and I hope they will be a little bit more fast-paced and that I will give them a higher rating as well, because I do really like Chloe C. Penaranda's writing style. I also bought another duology by her that I want to read in the next year. So I did enjoy this book, but because it was such a slow-paced book that I would have just wanted a little bit more, because it was a rather thick book as well. I just wished more had happened in like the first book of the series, but I'm very much looking forward to the next parts of it. And then on spot 28, the last 3-star rating that I gave is Assistant to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mehrer. I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm sorry. I like this book, but again, it ends on such a cliffhanger, and I just wished that books stop doing this. Like, I know it's because I want to sell the second book, but I like to have an ending that gives me like peace of mind, and then I also want to pick up the next book. I did really enjoy the setting of it. It was a very funny book, but again, it wasn't like the best fantasy book that I've read during the year, hence why it has 3 stars. I do, however, have high hopes for the next books. I also hope that the romance line, the romance plot is developed a bit more, because right now it's just like, it's staying at the same level and it's kind of annoying to me personally. Yeah, I did really enjoy the book. If you're looking into a fun fantasy romance with like a dragon and a villain and just the underdog type of story, then this is definitely something I would highly recommend. Up next, we have the only Sarah Yema's book that has 4 stars, and it is Throne of Glass. It is on spot number 27 in my list. I think this was the most enjoyable out of all of the Sarah Yema's books that I've read. I'm not sure which one it is exactly anymore, because all of them blend into each other for me. Yeah. I just gave this a 4 stars. I think it was the first book that I've read from her as well, and that's why I gave it a 4 stars. But yeah, again, it's an enjoyable book, and they're enjoyable series. They're not high hitters for me personally. After that, on spot number 26 is Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is the first book in the Farseer trilogy. We follow this young boy, Fitz, as you see him grow up, basically. The first book is really a coming-of-age story. We discover kind of a bit about his background. He has magical abilities that he doesn't know a lot about. And yeah, the first book was really good. I just wish the second one would have continued on that line. The second book is one that I DNF'd. On spot number 25 is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is a book in which we follow a main character who is a maid, who is like becoming some sort of holy person in the society that she lives in. She's been locked away in a castle where she has to stay, and in this world with vampires. She is not a vampire, however a lot of the characters around her are. So the one who's teaching her all sorts of things also in secret is teaching her how to fight, and she is not like the typical role that you would have expected from the maid in this society. A murder happens in the castle, a lot of things happen that are not really, you're not really sure at first what is going on, and then of course you will get some explanations. Is this the best book that I've read last year? Absolutely not. Did I enjoy it? Yes. Will I read more Jennifer Armentrout? Probably, but even now I have a difficult time recalling what happened in the book, so it was not as memorable. On spot 24 is King of Battle and Blood by Scarlett St. Clair. This was the first book in the Adrian X Isolde duology trilogy. It's going to have a third book. I'm not sure how many books there are going to be. In this book, we follow Adrian and Isolde. Isolde is the princess of a kingdom, and in that kingdom there is a war going on with vampires, and Adrian is the vampire king. Isolde's father, who's the king of her kingdom, decides to create an alliance with Adrian, which forces Isolde to marry him, and that's where we start off, so human and vampire. I really did enjoy the first book. It has a lot of spice. I think the building of the first book was done really well. I'm just kind of disappointed by the second one. And then on spot number 23 is another Scarlett St. Clair book. This one is A Touch of Darkness. It is the first book in the Hades and Persephone series. There's 7 books already. I did really enjoy the first book, but at the time I read it, I only had the first book. And I also didn't realize that you have to read them in a specific order. So first A Touch of and then A Game of, and that they alternate between Persephone's perspective and Hades' perspective. So I didn't know that, so I only had the first book. I have bought all 7 of them in the meantime, but I haven't continued the series, although I really did enjoy them. So yeah, it's set in this more contemporary world, like right now world, where Persephone writes for a magazine and Hades is this like important media figure in this world, and she interviews him, they fall in love, yada yada yada. I did really enjoy it. I really enjoyed the world building. Also the spice in the book is very good. It had enough of those mythical elements that I felt like it was actually based on something and not just characters called Hades and Persephone, as you sometimes have in other books. So yeah, if you're into romantasy with a lot of spice, I can highly recommend this to you. On spot number 22 is Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. The reason why it scores rather low is because the first book was really good, and then the second book kind of lacked a little bit for me. It was more of the same and not in a good way. In the first book, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, she specifically goes to a part of the world to document the fairies there, and I like that setting a lot more than the one that we're currently on, in which she's trying to save someone close to her. I'm not going to tell you who, because that person is also in the first book. So that's why this book only has 4 stars. The first one has 5, and you will see how high it scores later on. After that, on spot 21 is House of Dragons by Jessica Clues. This is a kind of Hunger Games type story. You have 5 houses, so 5 regions of a world, and their king dies. And the next person to become king has to go through this trial. So from each house, one person is selected. The selection goes a little bit different than anticipated, but those 5 characters is who you follow. The storylines alternate between all 5 of them. In the beginning, I was a little bit confused, but then once you get into it a little bit more, it becomes clear who is who, and you get to really know which plotline you are following. There is a little bit of overlap between them, but not too much that it's bothersome to me. I really love this book. I haven't given it a 5 stars because I felt like some of the characters weren't fleshed out enough and some of the plot lines lacked a little bit. Some things also just were too easy. Some things also didn't go explained. So for me, it could have been a 5-star read if there was a little bit more explanation and a little bit more difficulty level at the end. If you read this book, you will know what I'm talking about. And it hints to a book 2. I'm currently not sure when book 2 will release, if it will release ever, but I really did enjoy it. And if you like dragons, then read this book because it has like several very different types of dragons, and the dragons have personalities, and I really enjoyed it. On spot number 20 is The Foxglove King by Hannah F. Witten. I believe this was the first book from one of my book subscriptions that I read. I loved the way it looked. I loved the way that it was marketed, like it was a dark romance type of story. What I remember from it is that it was a dark setting, but like a dark romantic setting in a castle and with all of this like magical elements to it. Yeah, I really did enjoy it. There's a necromancy aspect to it, and if there's necromancy in a book, then I will most likely love it. So yeah, I really did enjoy The Foxglove King, and I hope book 2 of it comes out somewhere in the next years, because I would love to know how it continues. On spot number 19 is Bitterthorn by Kat Dunn, another book that I really did enjoy. I got it, I think I actually ordered it from the subscription service that I got it from, and it is an absolutely gorgeous book. We follow the story of Mara, who's a young girl living with her father. Her mother died, so she has a mother-in-law and stepsisters, and they don't really care about her. She is an odd child for them. She wants to read more than to be like presented nicely as a woman. And then there is a witch in a tower who more or less every 50 years comes to claim someone from the village that they live in, and this sacrifice can be chosen by the village. However, when the witch comes, Mara volunteers and actually goes with her. I'm not entirely sure if this is an adult or a YA book, but I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And if you're looking into a novel to read in a few days, then I would highly recommend picking this up. Up next, we have the 2 Sarah Hawley books that I read, A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon and A Demon's Guide to Wooing Witch. They are on spot 17 and 18. All of these books are part of the Glimmer Falls series, so there's going to be more books. In the first one, we follow a witch and a demon that the witch accidentally summons the demon, and then the demon and the witch fall in love and everything that's going on between them. And in the second book, we actually follow one of the friends of that witch as another demon tries to woo that witch. So we follow in every book characters that are from the same world, but not exactly the same character. And in the third book, we're gonna have a werewolf and a vampire, which I'm really excited about. Up next on spot 16 is God Killer by Hannah Kaner. I love this book. In this book, we follow 2 main characters. We follow on one side the God Killer, who tries to rid the world of false gods, of small gods, because gods have actually been banned kind of from this world, or a lot of them have been. And on the other side, we follow this young girl who for some reason has a god attached to herself, and they don't know why. Her family gets murdered while she's away trying to get to the God Killer to get help from them. Something else happens that I'm not gonna talk about just yet. Yeah, I really love this book. It was very fast-paced. A lot happened in a small amount of pages. Up next on spot number 15 is Bonesmith by Nikki Pau Preto. I saw this book all over YouTube, recommended to me by one of my favorite booktubers, and I wanted to really read it. So I bought it secondhand because I really wanted the special edition, and oh my god, I love this book. The reason I didn't give it 5-star is because I felt it was not fleshed out enough for me to be a 5-star read. However, I hope that book 2, which will be the conclusion of this duology, will be even better, and that maybe I will be able to give that a 5 stars, because I do really enjoy where the book is going. We follow the main character who has to graduate from like the school of becoming a bonesmith. Something odd happens at the end of the final trial that they have to go through, and due to that they are not specifically graduating. However, they are sent to an outpost to go and do some surveillance there. Something happens, and then she ends up on the other side of the protective wall that protects the world that she lives in from everything that's outside of it. So it's kind of like a kingdom with a wall around it, and you learn a lot about the world building, etc., which I thoroughly enjoyed. So again, a book that I highly recommend if you're into YA fantasy. It has a little bit of romance but no spice, and I just really enjoyed it because, well, bonesmiths are kind of like necromancers, but then also not. So yeah, I really loved it, and I'm super excited for book 2. On spot number 14, I have Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This is another standalone book by T. Kingfisher. In this book, we follow our main character as she goes on a kind of quest type story to save her sister, who is married to a very abusive prince. And who cannot cannot get away from the marriage and who just has to bear children for him, but he's very, very abusive towards the sister. So she goes on this quest, she meets a bone witch, and together they try and find a solution for the problem. It was a very enjoyable read. I really enjoyed the bone dog. At the beginning of the book, you do switch from present time to going back in time, and for me that was a little bit confusing at first, but honestly once the book gets going, like, I really enjoyed it. On spot number 13 we have These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan. I read this book on holiday. It was part of the library that the hotel we were staying at had, and I finished this book into one day. And back then I didn't have access to my e-reader like library to buy more books, etc. So I bought the second book, and it's somewhere over there. And the second book to this duology is on my TBR list for next year, for this year, for 2024. And I really enjoyed the first one. So you have this girl who lives in like a human world. There is a Fae world connected to the human world. And every so often the Fae world is opened to the human world. And this time it's opened because the prince of the Light Kingdom, so you have a light and a dark kingdom. The prince of the Light Kingdom is looking for a wife. She of course goes in there and all sorts of things happen. But she also meets the prince of the Dark Kingdom. At the end she makes a decision, but that decision doesn't really happen to be what she thought it would be. I really enjoyed this book and I'm very much looking forward to part 2. On spot number 12 is a book that hit me by surprise. It was Monsters Born and Made by Tanvi Bedwa. I don't think I've ever read a book that had this type of setting, that had more unique monsters than just your typical dragon and fairies, so that's why it's up here. In this book we follow our main character, who's a girl who wants to try and get a better life for her family, so she enters into these kind of like Hunger Games vibes trials to win glory and money for her family. This doesn't really go the way that she planned. The next book, Somewhere in the Deep, is coming out this year, and I'm also super excited to read that. So if you're into more aquatic themes, water-based monsters, etc., then I could highly recommend it to you. And then the final 4-star read for me of 2023 was The Mime Order by Samantha Shannon. I actually started reading the Bone season in 2022 and picked up the second book, The Mime Order, in 2023. I really love this series a lot. The only reason I'm not actively continuing it is because Samantha Shannon is rewriting the first few books instead of continuing the series, which I find kind of odd because I would love to continue it instead of having reworked versions of the first books. I do get it because there's a big gap between the first books and the book she's writing now, and timeline wise, it's been 10 years since she started writing, but still, I just wish she would continue the series. So for the Samantha Shannon The Bone Season series, I would recommend, if you haven't read them yet, to still wait a little bit. She has reworked the first book, she's currently working on the second one and then the third one, and then hopefully she will also continue on writing the story. The story is about people with psychic abilities that are kind of like the undercast of the society that they live in. They have to be kept in secret, there is a kind of underworld vibe to it, and the city that this is setting is kind of like a dystopian city. However, if they are discovered, they are kind of like cast away somehow. People don't really know what happens, so our main character gets imprisoned and she gets put into this other world type situation. I'm not gonna go too much into depth, you have to read the books for it. I personally really love them and I'm super excited to keep on reading them whenever they come out. And then of course we have my top 10. These were my absolute favorite books of the year. And I have at spots 10, 9 and 8 the Nevernight trilogy by Jay Kristoff. The only reason that they're at the bottom is because there's another Jay Kristoff book that I absolutely loved. And if you have seen a few of my videos, you might already know which one. So Nevernight, God's Grave and Dark Down, in which we all follow the main character Mia. At first this is more like a assassin school book and she's plotting her revenge on someone, and in the second book that continues, but then a plot twist happens at the end of the second book, and in the third book we continue on to that plot twist. The main character Mia is a very stubborn character. I personally really enjoy that because I tend to be stubborn as well. She has her very unique character traits and flaws, and I think it's good to not have this perfect main character. So if you are kind of more into the underdog heroes of stories, I would really recommend the Nevernight trilogy. On spot number 7, I have Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. The reason it is lower than Legends and Lattes is because it is the second book that was released by him in this type of setting. We follow our main character Viv, who's an orc who got battle damage and who has to recover into a small town in order to be able to continue fighting later on. In that town, there's not much. There is a bookshop and she starts helping out at that bookshop. Of course, more happens, but it's like a very cozy fantasy read and I really loved it. On spot number 6, I have Iron Flame, which is the second book in the Empyrean series by Rebecca Yarros. The first book, of course, is Fourth Wing. I put Iron Flame a little bit lower than Fourth Wing because Fourth Wing was really like the catalysator of the series and I just preferred the first book. Then on spot number 5, we have Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. In this book, we follow Viv the orc in a later setting than Bookshops and Bone Dust, in which she actually wants to retire from killing and doing quests, and she wants to start a coffee shop, and that is basically the setting of that book. I really enjoyed it, and for me, it's like the perfect read to like chill down and not worry too much. So that's why I really love this book and why it is on spot number 5 on my list. On spot number 4, we have Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This is the book that I wished Fantastical Beasts and Where to Find Them would have been. It is more of a diary-style book or journal-style book in which the main character Emily Wilde documents her journey. She goes to a specific part of the world to document the fairies that live there. Not all fairies are good fairies. There's a lot of like darker stuff happening as well. And I just really loved this book. So if you want to read it, pick it up. It's really worth it. On spot number 3, I have Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. This book really took me by surprise. It is one of the best books that I've read this year, hence why it is so high on my list. We have the two main characters who kind of are competing against each other in a newsletter type environment. They are trying to compete to get the columnist role that is available, which only one of them can get. And somehow they both have magical typewriters that are connected to each other. At first, they don't know that they're actually talking to each other, of course. And then the plot thickens as one of the characters decides to actually go find another job, go to the battlefront to document there as like a war reporter. And then finally the other one also joins, kind of, but the first one doesn't know it. So this is a story that has very big war influences. If you don't like war, even if it's a magical war, don't read this book. It was really heavy. It was really impactful. It had such beautiful moments in them, but also then with the contrast of the darkness of that war that is going on, it was absolutely beautiful. And the second book, Ruthless Vows, is already out. So if you read the first one, I would recommend also getting the second one because you will want more. I also wanted more, and I will read the second book pretty fast. On spot number 2 is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Fourth Wing was one of the books this year that really got me back into reading. It was a fast read. It was a intense read. It had high stakes. It had annoying characters. The main person that we follow is Violet Sorrengale, and she has to become a dragon rider instead of a scribe in the war school that she's at. Yeah, I really love this book. If you love dragons, if you like high fantasy, it feels a lot like a YA book, but it's actually like a adult book, but I feel it is new adult for people in their early 20s. The main characters are also in that age range and you really notice it. Yeah, I really love this book. It's one of my favorite reads of this year. I can't wait to see how this series continues. Is it the best book of the world? No. But for me, this book really opened me to reading a lot again. And I remember why I fell in love with fantasy reading at first. So Fourth Wing for me was a book that opened a lot of doors for me again, reading-wise. And yeah, I'm really happy that I was able to read it and find it and everything. And also my partner reads it and we both really enjoy them. So for me, Fourth Wing, I know some people love it, some people hate it. I really loved it. And then finally on spot number 1 is Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. I think you've heard me ramble about this book a lot already. We follow the main character Gabriel de Leon, who is a vampire who has done a lot of things in his life, and it is an interview style book. We have a dark, gloomy setting. There is a lot of dark humor, sarcastic humor in it. If you like pissed off vampires, if you like sarcastic vampires, then you will love this book. And I am beyond excited for book number 2, which is Empire of the Damned, and which comes out in March, and which is my priority read for March. So these were all of the books I read in 2023. This was a ridiculously long video, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very soon with more. Bye!